I'm happy to introduce actually 3 speakers for our next talk. So our next speakers are Nicola May, Chera Selby, and Tom Harris. And I first will introduce all of you. So Nicola May is a graphic designer specializing in work for animal rights and other social justice movements. She became involved in animal rights activism in 2001 after learning about the abuse happening inside Huntingdon Life Science. She also co-founded the Southern Animal Rights Coalition. And Chera Selby has been an animal rights advocate and activist for over 16 years now, and she dedicated herself fully to closing down HLS. Chera's passion to create a more just world never faded, and she continues to be an animal advocate working with various campaign groups. And then we also have Tom Harris, and he became involved in the animal liberation movement at the age of 15 when he attended his first hunt sap. He later co-founded the Southern Animal Rights Coalition and was heavily engaged in the SHAC campaign. And with SHAC, a story of compassion, resistance, and moving under siege, they are going to tell the story of the groundbreaking grassroots campaign against the vivisection company, Hunting Life Science, and the government repression that followed. So welcome, Tom, Nicola, and Chera Selby.
Thank you very much. While you may have heard about the repression that SHAC activists in the USA endured with the release of the Animal People documentary, a lesser known story is about the activists in the UK who face similar consequences for taking action in an attempt to end horrifying animal abuse. 13 years ago, we were all raided, arrested, and subsequently found ourselves sentenced to many years in prison for our role in the European Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty SHAC campaign. For years, we never talked about what happened to us. Our story was a frightening reminder of the consequences that we risk when we take action. However, we're coming together to talk about it now, because if they wanted to make an example out of us, we hope that we can be an example of just what a small group of individuals can achieve when we work together. And we hope to show you that whatever we endured, we are still here. We came through it. Meanwhile, the animals didn't. Whatever consequences we face pale in comparison to the horror that animals endure every single second of every single day. We are telling our story not to scare you, but hopefully to inspire you. Because in the words of Angela Davis, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all of the time, because change is possible. We see it every day. It's possible on a small scale, and it's possible on a big scale. And we just have to keep chipping away in whatever ways we are able to. We have to support each other along the way, because the path there won't always be easy, and above all, never ever give in. It's hard to describe the SHAC campaign without using grand-sounding adjectives. It was groundbreaking, it was world-shaking, and it is in all senses revolutionary. From 1999 until 2014, the SHAC campaign took the fight directly to Europe's largest animal testing laboratory, Huntingdon Life Sciences, and its uncompromising, unrelenting approach shook the entire vivisection industry to its core, costing the UK economy an estimated £1 billion a year. It was so effective and so unrelenting that the British and North American governments conspired to take it down by any means necessary. Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty was formed in the UK in 1999. The organisation had just one goal: to close down HLS, a laboratory exposed on tape for horrifying animal abuse. Having already successfully closed down 2 facilities breeding dogs and cats for the vivisection industry, the founding activists knew that protesting outside the laboratory would have little effect. Instead, they decided to launch a leaderless international economic pressure campaign, focusing on the companies who dealt with the lab. This included the customers, such as multi-billion-dollar agribusinesses and pharmaceutical companies, who were paying for the experiments at Huntingdon Life Sciences. The suppliers, who were providing services and goods, such as the animal breeders, the transporters, the cage suppliers, and the financiers, which included the shareholders, high street banks, and insurance providers. The SHAC campaign was remarkably effective. No group is more dangerous or to end animal testing. Europe-based Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty campaign warned the Journal of Life Sciences. The Financial Times described the effect of the grassroots movement. A small group of people have succeeded where Karl Marx, the Red Brigade, and the Baader-Meinhof gang all failed. Over 250 companies cut ties to the laboratory, including Citibank, the world's largest financial institution, Marsh, the world's largest insurance broker, and HSBC, the world's largest bank. It wasn't a change of heart that had convinced them, but rather a focused effort by campaigners that made the companies issue statements committing to have no further dealings with the laboratory. We were the barbarians at the gate, an alliance made up of the people who rarely get heard by the super rich. Tooth and nail, we went after their profits, and along the way refused to divide or fracture over broken windows or graffiti. If you were willing to fight to achieve SHAC's aims, you were welcome. While animals were continuing to suffer and die inside HLS, activists made sure that they could not be forgotten, stickering neighborhoods, writing letters, blocking phone lines, launching denial of service attacks, email blockading companies, sending black faxes, and staging office occupations. We took our campaign to the doorsteps of the CEOs of major corporations, demanding the decision makers take action by protesting at their homes, on their roofs, in their swimming pools, at their summer homes, their golf clubs, their yacht clubs, and at their society functions. If you were profiting from a contract with HLS, SHAC made sure that you were not about to forget about it. The number of activists isn't huge, but their impact has been incredible, complained Brian Cass, the managing director of HLS. After every single commercial bank in the UK ended up cutting ties with the laboratory, and after HLS was no longer able to borrow from any of the major world banks, the British government was forced to take the extraordinary step of providing HLS with a special bank account at the Bank of England. SHAC was determined to hit HLS where it hurt by obtaining and releasing a list of HLS shareholders, which included the ruling Labour Party's pension fund. The activists leaked the list to the Sunday Telegraph, which ran the story on their front page. And soon shareholders quickly sold their stock after being on the receiving end of demonstrations. The laboratory's share price subsequently plummeted to its lowest ever level, causing HLS to lose its market makers and its place on the London Stock Exchange, and SHAC effectively ran the company out of the UK. HLS ended up moving its headquarters to the USA, where activists soon joined in the fight to close them down, successfully convincing the New York Stock Exchange to back out of listing the laboratory's shares the morning they were due to be listed. An anonymous full-page advert costing hundreds of thousands of dollars was taken out in the New York Times, accusing SHAC of holding the NYSE hostage. The NYSEhostage.com website listed in the advert on that labor unions, environmental groups, and corporate accountability groups could copy SHAC's controversial tactics. The Center for Consumer Freedom, a corporately funded industry lobbying group, agreed, warning, activist groups are highly adaptable. They learn from one another. What will stop other groups, whether motivated by animal rights or some parallel fervour, from adopting the same tactics? While SHAC led an above-ground movement against the laboratory, the underground Animal Liberation Front also took notice of HLS. These activists took legal direct action against the listed companies in an effort to force them to sever their ties to the facility. Some activists, keen to target HLS from any and every angle possible, would undertake actions under the banner of both SHAC and the ALF, in the daytime participating in demonstrations, and at nighttime causing economic sabotage or liberating animals from laboratories and lab breeders. While other campaigns often distanced themselves from the ALF, SHAC acknowledged that taking direct action was an essential tool in the struggle for liberation, recognizing that throughout history, the most successful movements have usually involved both legal and illegal forms of protest. SHAC advocated prisoner solidarity and encouraged prisoner support for those who had been jailed for crimes relating to animal liberation, while simultaneously emphasizing that the SHAC organization itself was not involved in any criminality and operated purely on a legal basis against HLS. SHAC took a radical approach to its activism, which became known as the SHAC model, and that is what Tom is going to talk about today. During the campaign, there was a lot of discussion about the SHAC model by all kinds of progressive activists, as well as anti-vivisection and animal rights groups, anti-GM campaigners in Europe, arms protesters in the UK, and ecological activists in the USA all studied and imitated the SHAC campaign. Some of the campaigns were successful, others less so, and so today, Tom will explain to you exactly what the SHAC model was and how you can apply it to your activism. SHAC became infamous for targeting HLS's financial associates, including their shareholders, market makers, insurance brokers, and financial lenders. But what many people missed was that this was a result of the SHAC model and not the SHAC model itself. The same is true for taking protests to people's doorsteps and utilizing the unsolicited help of the ALF and similar groups. The SHAC model was not any specific action or any given strategy carried out by or in the name of SHAC. It was a mindset, a way of viewing and conducting a campaign with brutal efficiency. And it is a mindset which has the potential to win any campaign, which is why the state and the targeted industries feared it so vehemently. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Jera. So as Jera said, I'm going to just try to briefly explain what the SHAC model was, and hopefully it's something that might be able to help you with your own campaigning. I just want to put a slide up which covers the 7 points that I feel cover what the SHAC model was. So hopefully you can all see that while I just run through them. So point 1 is to identify your target, not just any target, but one that you feel that you can win realistically with the resources you have available to you. Point 2 is to research your target. Before you do a single protest or action, you must know every single element of what makes your target company profitable. You need to know what its weaknesses are and what they need to stay open. Visual evidence of your target's wrongdoing and animal abuse is almost essential. Point 3 is to look for bottlenecks in your target. These are any aspect of the business which could easily be removed, but which could have a big and hopefully fatal impact on your target company. Point 4 is to decide upon the most effective strategies and tactics to remove those specific bottlenecks. It is vital that you're adaptive. If someone puts up a wall in front of you, you've got to find a way over, under, around, or through it. And if the goalposts are moved, decide whether it's best to move with them or to find another bottleneck. Point 5 is to make it personal. This means to hold individuals personally accountable for their decisions and not let them hide behind the obscurity of a faceless corporation. Point 6 is to set yourself long-term goals, such as closing your target, medium-term goals, which are taking out the significant bottlenecks which will take you to that point, and short-term goals, which are small victories along the way, which serve both to grind down your target's morale while simultaneously lifting your own. Point 7 is to never give up until you've won. So that all sounds pretty simple, perhaps even obvious. But if used correctly, it is a powerful approach. When the campaigns which tried to copy SHAC did fail, it was usually because they saw the efficient strategies which worked for SHAC and tried to replicate them exactly. SHAC, on the other hand, were never working to a set playbook. The reason our financial campaign, for example, was so effective was because of the very specific financial situation that Huntingdon Life Sciences were in. We picked each strategy because it would be effective in the situation we found ourselves in and constantly adapted to the specific situations we were confronted with. Replicating those tactics out of context will never be effective. You have to look at the strategies which will be most effective against your target's bottlenecks. So to put all of that into context with the SHAC campaign, I'm going to put that slide back up and go over each of those 7 points and explain exactly how SHAC applied each of those points in practice. So there we go. So point 1, HLS were identified as a target for very specific reasons. Following a horrific undercover investigation in 1997, many of HLS's customers deserted them. Their share price dropped by 30% in 1 year, and they were facing financial ruin. In an attempt to save themselves, they secured a substantial loan from the NatWest Bank so that they could purchase a new laboratory in the hope it would generate new custom and enough income to save them from closure. By the time SHAC was actually formed, all that was required to close down HLS was convincing the NatWest Bank to revoke their loan. It was an entirely winnable campaign, although we obviously now know that the British government had very different ideas on that. So point 2, as time went on, SHAC became a formidable research engine, teaching ourselves more about how corporations exist than many company executives know themselves. With the undercover footage, there was plenty of compelling evidence to supply both the public and HLS's collaborators. We hid in bushes to see who was going in and out of the laboratory so we could identify their suppliers. We used trial and error to identify how different companies formatted their email addresses and worked out which blocks of phone numbers they owned. We joined banking organizations to uncover shareholders, pretended to be students to the SEC to learn what businesses need to operate. We dug through trash and developed a network of whistleblowers and spies who fed us a constant stream of information so much so that we even had information leaked to us from the Prime Minister Tony Blair's desk. Point 3, the bottlenecks. So through all this research, we uncovered a trove of bottlenecks. As well as the obvious NatWest loan, we also were able to use our network of informants and our research to isolate and pick off bottleneck after bottleneck, which resulted in HLS having to build their own laundry, their own crematorium, their own gas pipeline, and in a move which hasn't happened before or since, they were bailed out and given both banking and insurance services by the British government. Point 4, the strategizing. And I would say this is where the true genius of SHAC lay. So there's many examples of SHAC's efficient strategies. For example, when the NatWest Bank did pull out and cancel their loan, the campaign launched SHAC USA and switched straight to HLS's new secret lender in America. And when they pulled out, the focus shifted straight onto HLS's insurance broker, Marsh, under the theory that if they didn't have insurance, then they couldn't have a company. On the ground level, perhaps the most clear example of this lateral thinking came when home demos were banned in the UK. Initially, the law was changed so that you had to leave when directed to by a police officer. So, in response, the very next home demonstration which took place was held on the roof of a campaign target's house. And when the protesters were asked to leave, they simply pointed out that they couldn't get down. Obviously, the police didn't really like that tactic and so overreacted, as they tend to do. So other activists came up with another idea, which was to set up campsites near to the target's home, but not near enough to fall foul of the new law. From those camps, 24-hour protests were arranged. So a group would go from the camp to the target's house, hold a protest, and as soon as the police asked them to leave, they would come back to the camp and another group would go and continue the protest. So this would go on day and night, and there was very little the police could do. Obviously, these protests also got clamped down on by the police. And so then protesters simply made home demos louder and faster, leaving before the police could even arrive and ask them to leave. And as home demos became harder in the UK, activists from Britain simply traveled to Europe to carry out home protests there with our friends and colleagues on the continent. Point 5, making it personal. For SHAC, this was very literal. We would go to the home address of the person, the directors of companies who are dealing with Huntingdon, and hold loud, noisy protests on their doorstep so that they and all their neighborhood knew exactly who we were upset with. But we also encouraged our supporters to direct their criticisms to the individual who had signed a contract with HLS rather than just the company they worked for, which is a far more efficient tactic than targeting the company itself. Point 6, the long-term goal of the SHAC campaign was, of course, to close down HLS. Then the medium-term goals were the large bottlenecks I've mentioned, NatWest Bank, Stevens Inc., and Marsh, their insurer. But along the way, we had hundreds of small victories as HLS's suppliers, customers, shareholders, and other financial support flocked to desert them. And point 7, finally, the reason that SHAC came so close to winning on so many occasions, and the reason we were only defeated by extreme government intervention, was because those heading the campaign worked on it every single hour of every single day. We were constantly exhausted, we never took our eyes off the prize, and we lived, breathed, and dreamt of closing down HLS. Let me just get rid of this for you. And I really hope that some of what I've just covered will be useful to your own campaigning. And if you have any questions on that or anything else we're talking about or anything else to do with us, please hang around for the Q&A we're going to be having after this chat. But for now, I'm going to pass over to Nikki, who's going to discuss how the SHAC campaign actually came to an end.
Thanks, Tom. So throughout the history of SHAC, the UK government routinely amended and brought out new laws to try and repress the campaign. All of these measures were designed to limit and prevent lawful protest tactics. These not only affected SHAC, but they still affect other protest movements to this day. We saw home protests banned, individual company shareholders were granted anonymity, and trespass laws became stricter. To try and stop activists using encryption, new laws were brought out that made it an offence to withhold passwords. Then on top of that, a special law was brought out which made it an offence to interfere with customers and suppliers or cause economic loss to an animal research laboratory. Antisocial behaviour orders and injunctions were also used to restrict and ban individuals from attending protests. With each new law, the campaign had to constantly adapt and evolve to the situation to stay effective. It did cause great frustration within the movement, which is why I think so many people turned to illegal direct action that was independent of the campaign. It became impossible to carry out effective lawful campaigning. SHAC itself remained a lawful organisation. It made great efforts to stay within the law, even though they pushed it to the edge. Barristers routinely checked websites, newsletters, flyers, and we even worked with the police to organise protests. However, as each protest tactic became too effective, it was criminalised. I've heard many people say that it was inevitable that SHAC would be crushed by the government due to their confrontational tactics. But I think it's far more complicated. SHAC was crushed for two reasons. The first reason was that the UK Chancellor Gordon Brown had pinned his whole economic plan and career around research and development. He needed laboratories and the pharmaceutical industry to be successful to build a strong economy. So when GSK and the coalition of Japanese pharmaceuticals started threatening to pull investment from the UK, the government took it very seriously. They were worried that GDP would shrink by 2% and that we would enter recession. So yes, there's no denying that direct action happened and it was clamped down on and it was convenient for securing convictions. But that was not the sole reason SHAC was taken out, because the vast majority of SHAC prisoners were never even accused of direct action, but just much more mundane activities. And even before SHAC formed, there was evidence of the pharmaceutical industry blackmailing the government for deregulation, new laws, and cutting red tape. Every time they wanted something, they just threatened to leave. So around 2004 to 2005, the pharmaceutical industry and police planted a spy within SHAC. His name was Adrian Radford. He acted like an agent provocateur, and he also learned how the campaign functioned and operated. So in the same way that SHAC researched every aspect of HLS, this spy researched and exposed SHAC's bottlenecks to the police. This led the police to be able to target things like SHAC's finances, bank accounts, postal address, as well as identify which activists were important to the campaign. The police also used the media to smear the campaign and control the narrative to turn the public against us. Then, on the 1st of May 2007, 700 police officers in riot gear raided activist homes across the UK and a few in Europe. It was the largest operation of its kind. Their aim was to cut the head off of SHAC in one swoop, so that SHAC would be no more in one day. We were all arrested for blackmail. Some activists were charged and remanded, and others were charged and given strict bail conditions, like Jera. It was brutal, and the police really expected SHAC to be no more. I remember when the police told me I was under arrest for blackmail, and I wasn't worried at all. I knew I hadn't blackmailed anyone, I just had no idea what was coming. The police failed to anticipate that other activists would resist the entire operation and step in to keep SHAC running, which is what I tried hard to do along with Tom and others. We were on bail but not charged following the raids, so we decided to help keep the campaign running. We wanted to keep it ticking over until everyone got released from charges. We thought the charges were ridiculous, and like no one predicted that we'd end up in prison. The blackmail charge itself was really bizarre. Activists were charged with making an unwarranted demand with menace. The unwarranted demand was simply asking companies to sever their ties with Huntingdon, and the menace was the campaign itself and any action any individual took, even if it was independent of SHAC. So following the raids, our resources were quite depleted, and so we tried to focus on Huntingdon's finances and their backers. We felt at the time that those were the softest targets. And even with our limited resources, we did continue to have further success. And we damaged the share price further to the point they had to become a private company. And not long before our trial, Huntingdon failed to meet a huge loan repayment. We knew at this point that they were in a bad way, And we felt like if we could just hold on a bit longer, they could fall at any moment. Sadly, we faced very aggressive police tactics during this period of time. We faced further police raids, further arrests, 3 more police spies, and we started having trouble even obtaining bank accounts and services. It became clear to us that if we carried on, they were going to keep harassing us just for carrying out lawful activities. You have to remember at this point, we were very limited in our capabilities. So all we were doing was carrying out lawful protests, email action alerts, running a website, producing a newsletter. But because we continued to run SHAC, we then ended up charged with blackmail too. Again, this was nothing to do with any actions we'd taken. It was just to get us out of the way. Ultimately, a lot of us ended up in prison. And even after I went to prison, more activists took over the campaign, but they then faced the same aggression and repression until they were sent to jail. In all, there were 4 trials, 2 extraditions from the Netherlands, and prison sentences ranging from 15 months to 11 years in prison. Before you're sentenced, you're assessed by the probation service. And during my assessment, I was told that my probation officer had been visited by men in suits. He told me I was worse than a suicide bomber and that I was a threat to national security. And bear in mind, I was convicted of organising non-violent protests, designing a newsletter, sending email action alerts, and attending a barbecue. Even as prisoners, we were treated very differently to the rest of the prison population. We were denied access to open prisons and denied day releases near the end of our sentence. We were deemed the highest risk offenders. The same men in suits even visited one of the prisons where our co-defendants was held and threatened to fire the prison governor if he offered them day release. Even on release from prison, we faced more draconian measures, and documents we've seen stated this was to frustrate our political activity. We were banned from talking to each other, banned from meetings, banned from protests, banned from discussing animal rights. The authorities went above and beyond to ensure it was impossible for us to campaign in any way. A number of our co-defendants have received lifetime bans on animal rights campaigning. They are not allowed to even have a conversation with someone about animal testing. If they breach this order, they could face another 5 years in prison. It reached a point where the campaign had to be closed by us voluntarily because whoever stepped in would just be next. It was soul destroying, but we had no option. No one wanted to be the next living target, and we could no longer be an effective campaign. HLS never fully recovered from the SHAC campaign, and they were recently bought out by Covance, a much larger contract research organisation. The site still sits there to this day, and the UK anti-vivisection movement has never fully recovered. This year, the final SHAC activist was released from prison, and except for a 3-month period, this is the first time in 20 years that we don't have a SHAC activist in prison. Overall, throughout the campaign, we definitely developed an effective model for applying economic pressure to a company. If the government hadn't continually bailed out HLS and kept throwing us in prison, HLS would have closed. They were effectively on the brink of closure a number of times, and in any other circumstances, they would have closed and we'd have moved on to our next target. Unfortunately, while we developed an effective model, the authorities also developed an effective model to crush us. And this is really important to each and every one of us. We may be in different countries running different campaigns, but the ramifications of SHAC could affect anyone. The tactics used against us by the police didn't just come out of nowhere. It was done in collaboration with the FBI, as they had successfully taken out SHAC USA. If anyone's seen The Animal People, then you know what happened there. George Bush and Tony Blair had lengthy discussions about how they wanted to extend the war on terror to SHAC. And so the UK liaised and worked with the FBI to do the same to us. And we already know the police here have collaborated with some European police forces. So that's why I think it's important to learn about what happened to SHAC, because you never know what's coming your way. We hope this brief overview of the campaign has given you something to think about. If you'd like to hear about our prison experiences, or what it's like to have spies planted in your life, or whether we have any regrets, please join our panel and bring along your questions. If you can't join us, we're happy to be contacted on our social media channels. We're always there for anyone in terms of support, advice, or friendship. I'd just like to end with a quote from Gordon Mills, who's a specialist animal rights police officer, and he's talking about our case. He said, "The success of this initiative has had far-reaching implications for human rights and the ability of people to protest in a democratic society. The post-2004 era witnessed a new age of animal rights activity and associated extremism. However, it also witnessed a new era in policing protests that will continue to have huge ramifications for our democracy."
Perfect. Yeah, I think we're done. But again, we just want to thank everyone for coming and listening to this. And as Jared said at the start, SHAC was an epic 15-year campaign, which broke all kinds of new ground, and condensing that into 30 minutes is pretty much impossible. So we hope we've done our best, and we hope that we've given people something to think about and something they can take out of it. But we know we've definitely missed a lot of things. I'm in the process of writing a book on the history of their campaign, which I'm hoping will be out next year. So keep an eye out for that. But in the meantime, if there is anything else you'd like to ask, as Nikki said, then please just hang around, because we will be doing a Q&A in a bit.
There are a lot of questions coming in right now, and so we have more time even to answer them. So I will just start with the first question, and you can just decide who will answer it, I think, or you can all answer after each other. So the first question would be, first of all, thank you for everything you've done for animals. My question is, do you think the animal rights movement will apply SHAC-style tactics to a campaign again, and how can we encourage this?
Okay. Hi, Laura. So I think in the SHAC model that I laid out, I think a lot of campaigns have already come close, and I think there's a lot of signs that various campaigns are kind of heading back almost full circle towards that kind of thing. I think we're seeing more kind of like home demonstrations, for example, happening, and more direct targeting of specific companies rather than kind of the more kind of holistic approach that is often taken. So I think probably we will see more SHAC style tactics happening. Whether there will be another campaign like SHAC, I don't know. I feel partly that SHAC was very much set in a specific era, and there's very specific people kind of taking the lead on the direction of it and stuff. So I think whether it is replicated to the same kind of success very much comes down to who takes up campaigns and the kind of campaigns they end up picking, and a bit of luck and a bit of bad luck and whatever else. But yeah, I think it will happen again, and I think it's increasingly happening. In terms of encouraging it, I think my philosophy has always been just to lead by example. If there's a tactic that you think is efficient or effective or likely to work, then just do it. And I know it's very much something we always felt with SHAC was, if we wanted to do something, we would go out and do it. If it meant standing on your own in the rain with no one else there, like screaming in the wind, then that's what it meant. And yeah, just to get on and do it and hope others follow your example. So I think that's the main thing you can do, is just go out and do the campaigning that you think is effective. And if it's proved to be effective, then people would join you.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, you mentioned that you were living and breathing the campaign. How did you make sure that you're resilient, take care of yourself to be able to keep going? I think, Tom, you mentioned that.
Yes, I did. I think for me, I mean, I'm a ridiculously positive person, and I actually find that, like, I guess my mental health and my resilience was a lot stronger when I was actively fighting for something than it is now, when I've been kind of a bit broken by the system and feel kind of struggle to find my place in the movement. And I'm definitely nowhere near, if even a fraction of as active as I was. And I find that a lot harder on my resilience and mental health than actually when I was campaigning 24 hours a day. But I think for me, a big part of it is when you're campaigning against a company, if you've seen pictures of animal cruelty and, you know, you've read newsletters and seen videos, obviously that kind of motivates you, but there's a few instances in my life where I've actually been face to face with those animals, whether it's in the battery farms with chickens or factory farms or whatever. But one specific incident for me was a protest that I attended, I think in 2001. And we ended up almost by accident at a breeding facility called Harlan Interfauna, which is very near to HLS. And it's actually where they breed most of the dogs that go to Huntingdon. And I got there a bit early and the rest of the protest hadn't quite turned up, and I had police all around me. And then suddenly the main protest turned up at the front gate and all the police ran off to join them. So I was left alone at the back of the facility. And I didn't even think about it, but pretty much the next thing I knew, I'd climbed up over the fence and over the razor wire, and I was inside with the dogs. And I spent 2 hours in there. And there was a small corridor that I managed to get into, and it was just obviously lined with cages full of dogs, or pens with dogs in. And it's really hard to talk about still, and this was like nearly 20 years ago. But there was, all of the dogs were terrified to see a human, obviously because of the way they're treated. There was some were like bleeding from the mouth where they tried to chew their way out of the metal bars. There was like no bedding, it was just a concrete floor with a small amount of like sawdust that was soaked in urine and feces, which was literally running out of the bars with blood. There was just a concrete bench at the back of the thing, and they were just terrified. And there was one dog that it was obviously a lot younger, and it hadn't received the trauma apparently that the others had at that point, or it still had some kind of hope. And it was running up, and it was letting me play with it through the bars, while all the rest were just cowering at the back and shaking. And like, I promised that dog that I'd never stop fighting until I closed HLS. And I mean, that never left me. And even now that hasn't left me. And I kind of, like, every day now I hate myself that I broke that promise. But yeah, so that kind of kept me going, and nothing else really mattered to me at the time.
Oh, wow. Okay. If Nicola or Jara, if you want to add something, you can just interrupt me at any time. I will just go on with the next question. Can you go into more detail about identifying bottlenecks? Can you share some other examples of these, and how did you determine which would be the next one to tackle?
I can answer that. So basically, you just need to research anything and everything about your target. Look at how they function, how they make money, what services they need. You just sort of break it all down, and then you look for any weaknesses, like, do they have a supplier which, you know, if they withdrew, would it be easy to replace them? How can you affect their money? It's just trying to identify weaknesses. It's going to be different in every company. Like, we ran 2 other campaigns using the same model. For example, we ran a campaign against a puppy farmer, and when we looked at his company, we found his bottleneck was just the fact that he was renting this land from the MOD, and so we knew, like, if we could just get rid of that, he wouldn't have a breeding site. And then we knew that if people wouldn't buy his puppies, then he would lose his income. So we just focused on those 2 things. We ran a campaign against a goat laboratory, and, you know, that was a very different campaign, and we knew the weakness there was just the fact that the experiments happening in the laboratory were repeat experiments. So we knew that we had to just speak to whoever was signing the licenses for those experiments, and that was the weakness. And so we lobbied the government and had those tests banned. So every campaign is going to have different bottlenecks, and really it's just research, and looking at any weaknesses you can identify. And in terms of, like, how to know which one to tackle, I guess, like, it's just whatever resources you've got and how you think you can be most effective. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add on that.
No, I think you covered it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. The next question is, first, thank you for being so strong fighting this important issue. And what is your personal tip to deal with feeling of being David fighting against Goliath? And second question, what is your personal tip to deal with paranoia of being listened to by secret agencies?
I can answer that, I guess. So I think that, like, for me, I think that when it's like a David and Goliath battle, you just have to look at history, and we see that we have always been trying to fight these massive institutions that it seems almost impossible, that everything seems impossible until it's done. And I think that you just have to believe, it's like that Angela Davis quote that I started with, you have to believe that you can change the world, because we can change the world. We've changed the world in the past and we can keep changing it. And I think the only kind of thing that will stop us from achieving whatever our goals are is believing that we can't change anything, we can't make any difference, because we can make a difference. We just have to believe in ourselves and keep going. And the second tip about dealing with paranoia, I think a lot of us, we kind of, after our convictions, it was really hard to sort of like get over it, because we had like jokes that we'd said like in between friends, because they had put recording devices in our cars and in our offices, and kind of quote jokes that we'd just been saying between friends were used out of context and used to make up this kind of like conspiracy that they had put in their heads. And so I think Nikki mentioned how we all got accused because we went to a barbecue, and that was like part of it, was like we hung out with each other and suddenly this barbecue was a conspiracy meeting. And I think it's very easy, like after you've gone through this thing and you've seen how any joke you say could be used against you, it's really easy to like lose any sense of humor, and it's really easy to not want to say anything, because anything you say can be used against you. It's like, you know, what the police say to you when they arrest you, anything you say will be used against you in court. But I think that there comes a point when you sort of realize that you have to take risks and you have to confront those fears. I think, you know, what's the saddest thing is us never trying, us never attempting to change anything, us never speaking out because we're scared that it will be used against us. And I think that at some point you sort of just have to take the risk, and hope that when it comes down to it, if you're ever in court again, that you'll be able to explain that you maybe have a bad sense of humor.
I think as well with the David v Goliath thing, I think that was one of the really strong things about the SHAC campaign, because I think often if you're campaigning against a large corporation, and some of the companies, even beyond HLS, some of the companies we took on were some of the biggest companies in the world, and we beat them. And often in those kind of situations where you're taking on these massive banks and industrial lobby groups and things like that, you do feel like you're David v Goliath, and you can't see how you can kind of get past this edifice of this big corporate kind of facade. Whereas with SHAC, we were taking it to individuals in that company, and these individuals are human. These individuals aren't Goliath. They're people just like us. They just have a lot more money than us and a lot more power than us. And so some of the actions we took, for example, like one of the top directors at Huntingdon's insurance broker, Marsh, he's like a multi-millionaire. He has a massive mansion in Surrey. Like on one protest, like me and some of my friends like occupied his swimming pool. And so suddenly you see these people are just people. Like he was freaking out and his wife was freaking out, and there's all these kind of crusty punks swimming in his swimming pool. And he's not Goliath. He's a guy with too much money who's suddenly facing reality and suddenly having people say no to him. And again, the same director, he was the director of I think it was the English National Ballet. And so when they did a tour of the Nutcracker on the opening night, there was a protest inside the theatre. People bought tickets and halfway through just stood up, like hung banners over the balcony and let megaphones off and stuff. And it was a bit cringe and it was a bit awkward, but that guy then suddenly, like, he loved the ballet, and he suddenly found himself having to resign from the board of directors of the English National Ballet. He had to resign from directorships of like top schools and all these different, all the things, all his passions in his life. He started kind of having to choose between dealing with this animal abusing company or dealing with the things that he loved in his life. And he's not a Goliath anymore. He's just a guy, and we can beat them. Like, money and power is only money and power if you take it as seriously as they take it. And I guess for me, because I came from kind of, like I said, like a kind of crusty punk kind of background, it never really bothered me. Like I always kind of wanted to take the fight to people who are powerful, who are stomping down on weaker people. Like those are the people that we need to confront. And if we're not fighting Goliath, who are we fighting? And with the paranoia of being listened to, I mean, for us, it wasn't paranoia, like we were being listened to. And I think because we knew it, like, I don't know if it ever particularly bothered us. Like we knew if we, you know, like, I mean, things have changed with mobile phones and stuff now. It's kind of odd for us, but you know, it was normal for us. We would just take a battery out of our phone and leave it at home. Like whatever we were talking about, you know, if we're talking about dog sitting or something, or going for a walk on the beach, we'd be like, let's just leave our phones at home because we know they're listening, and they, you know, had us under surveillance. And yeah, it was just kind of part of our life being listened to. It's weird, but it's what it was.
In terms of the David against Goliath, like I didn't find I was personally fazed by this aspect. I just saw it as like having to chip away at this big target, and like every company that severed their ties made HLS weaker, and this target just getting smaller and smaller. So you know, I always felt like it was something we could do, and it was just like chipping away. I didn't really think of it as a huge like target. It was just a string of victories along the way. And yeah, in terms of the paranoia, yeah, I guess we just had to be aware that we were being monitored. But other than that, I didn't really think about it day to day.
Okay, thank you. It's very inspiring how positive you are after all you've been through. I think it's very interesting. The next question is, was the SHAC campaign in UK and Europe very different from the SHAC campaign in the US, or was there a close collaboration and joint actions taking place?
Between the US, I mean, they were separate and they were different, but there was a lot of close cooperation. I think because in America, North America, because they've got the First Amendment right to free speech, that was something we definitely didn't have. So they kind of were able to kind of, well, they thought they were able to say and do things that we couldn't say or do here. However, obviously, it turned out that they couldn't say those things because the government kind of changed their constitution. But so there was different tactics used on each side of the Atlantic, and it was very much like America was coordinated in America and Britain was coordinated in Britain, but there was a lot of back and forth on who the key targets were and kind of where to kind of head the campaign. So it was a bit of both. There was definitely, we worked together, but also they were two distinct kind of campaigns, if that makes sense.
Okay, the next question is, first, thanks for this talk. It's really good to hear about such an influential and inspiring campaign. My question is, with hindsight, do you think there was anything different you would have done to avoid or minimize the effect of the repression?
I don't think I would have done anything differently, and I definitely don't have any regrets. But I think in terms of repression, like if the movement had been stronger, then maybe we would have weathered it better. You know, it's definitely taught me that we really need to build strong communities within the movement and have stronger activist support. We were just like a handful of activists, and you know, we were just taken out, and there was nothing left behind. So I definitely think, you know, focus on strong communities, activist support. Does anyone else have anything?
Yeah, I'd add to that and say, I think I've got two things. I, again, like Nikki, don't regret at all for a second having tried to take on this industry. I think that we all should be doing what we can. That said, I think that following our arrest, there's like two kind of regrets that I have. And one was we allowed the police and the companies to sort of take control of the media narrative. And I regret that. I think that we should have spoken out in the press. They use like a lot of they slandered us in the press, basically. They used things that had happened throughout the history of the campaign, and we were kind of blamed for all of it. And they threw all this stuff at us. And I feel that the animals were forgotten from the story. All the press articles, they just concentrated on like certain things that had happened throughout the campaign and like the tactics that we used. And the story of why this was happening was just forgotten. And I really kind of wish that we had, explained more and shown the public exactly why activists had taken the steps that they had taken, why this campaign was so strongly fought. And so that is like a regret of mine. I think like at the time, like it was hard because we hadn't been expecting what happened to us. We knew that the police were targeting us, but I think kind of what happened to us happened so out of the blue, and it's sort of like never really happened to other activists, and that we were all isolated from each other. We couldn't talk to each other. We couldn't kind of come up with the strategy for our defense. We were just like all separated from each other, not allowed to speak with each other. And so for me personally, I didn't want to like say, oh, I'm going to start speaking out because like maybe my co-defendants wouldn't want that and things. And so it was kind of hard because like we couldn't discuss those things. I think maybe like should always be a focus of any kind of campaign, is to discuss what kind of media strategy you will use if ever the situation kind of comes up again. And secondly, what was the other thing? I think I've lost the question. I don't know. Does anyone else have anything to add on? Or maybe I can add on again from.
I have a couple of things to add on it. I think obviously hindsight is a wonderful thing. I think a big thing to bear in mind is, as I kind of mentioned on my point 7, is while we were running the campaign, or while the campaign was in full steam, we were spending all of our time working on the campaign. And so when I look back and think, oh, we should have done this, we should have done that, then it's like, but who would have done it? Where would the time have come from? How would we have paid for it? And so I think from that aspect, like I don't really have any regrets, and I don't think there was much we could have changed at the time. I think maybe if you're going forward, like Nikki said, I think it's definitely worth trying to build a stronger movement. I think a big problem we had was because our campaign, because it started so simple where we had to take out NatWest, and then it evolved into this campaign where we were taking out like market makers and insurance brokers and all these kind of businesses and industries that most people don't really understand how they operate and what they are. And so there came a point, I suppose, in the campaign where only a very small amount of people fully understood the wider strategy of the campaign. And so therefore it became very hard for people to say, actually, maybe we should do this instead of this, because most people were like, I don't really get what's going on, but it seems to be working. So I suppose were it to happen again, it would definitely be worth maybe having some kind of workshops and things to help people understand the complexities of the industry and the complexities of big business. So I think that's something. I think there was, as I said again, with to answering Laura's question earlier, our attitude with SHAC was very much kind of like, come and join us or else don't bother. And I kind of think in some ways that's a good thing. You should always lead by example. But I think there were definitely times through the campaign where it was a bit too forceful, and it kind of, people thought, oh, I don't like that tactic, so I'm going to go and start another campaign or join another campaign. So I think that there was definitely room for a bit more kind of empathy with activists that were working in it. So I mean, there's things, and it mostly, I suppose, like most things, it comes down to individual interactions. In terms of what Jera was saying, I definitely agree that we need to communicate our message better, and we need to engage with the public and try and build a big strong movement. I think the problem is what Jera was saying about how the police use the press against us, and that we should have utilized the press more. But we were taking on and taking out these multi-millionaire and multi-billionaire businessmen normally, and those are the people that run our media. So they were never going to write flattering articles about us. As soon as we started targeting their friends, then they're going to hate us. And so I don't think we ever really stood a chance in the media of kind of controlling that narrative, but I think we could definitely have done more to control our own narrative. I think we very much, whilst SHAC was separate from the ALF, we were very kind of happy to kind of use the kind of climate of fear, as the police called it, that the kind of Animal Liberation Front, the Justice League, Animal Rights Militia, whoever, they built up this kind of climate of fear separate to the campaign, and we were kind of happy to kind of wallow on the edges of that and kind of use it to our advantage. And actually we should probably have not made that quite so easy for the police. So I mean, there's yeah, it's hard, but not really. I think we did the best we could do under the circumstances.
I remembered my thing. So I just wanted to say, I think one of the things that would have really helped to, for me personally, like, was that I think we have this great kind of like prisoner solidarity movement when you're in prison. But when you come out of prison, I think that sometimes you're kind of forgotten about. And I know that, like, for myself, as soon as like these conditions were removed from me, like when I got released from prison, I was on probation. I wasn't allowed to be involved in any animal rights or any animal welfare or any kind of social justice causes. But when those restrictions were removed from me, I was allowed to be involved. But suddenly it's like you'd been removed from animal rights for so long that for me, I felt like an imposter. I was like, you know, I was a teenager when I was involved in the SHAC campaign. I'd only like had like maybe a year of like full on activism. But then I'd had this like 6-year experience of this like most brutal kind of state repression. And I came back to it and everything was really triggering. It was like all these new faces, the whole movement had changed. That it was really hard for me to like know how to get back involved, even though if I was kind of wanted still in this movement. I think one of the most important kind of ways that we overcome repression is to support each other and to like show solidarity. And so like for me personally, I'd have liked it if I'd had maybe someone to kind of hold my hand and to show me like, you know, oh, you're welcome, you like, you know, come and join this, do this, and like to kind of tell me what I needed to be doing. Because I think after like this kind of experience, you're so lost and you don't really know what you're doing. But I think that some kind of like prisoner solidarity is definitely the way to help overcome repression.
Actually, yeah, that's a really good point, and I kind of want to add to it a little bit, because I did find while I was in prison, I did get a lot of letters and a lot of Christmas cards, and that was really nice. And thank you so much if anyone's watching this who sent me anything. It was really appreciated. But because we were first arrested in May 2007, and then obviously Jera was charged, and me and Nikki weren't at that point. And so me and Nikki carried on campaigning for as long as we could, running SHAC and various other things. But there came a point when we physically couldn't keep it going because we had so many conditions. We had like electronic tagging, like we had like police surveillance, and so there was very little we could do at that point. And so that was probably about, I can't remember if that was 2008, 2009 maybe. We had to completely pretty much cut ourselves off from the movement. And from that point until I was off license from prison, which was in 2015, so that's 7 years, I had like no real contact with the movement. And so when I got out, the movement that I knew had gone completely. Like the animal rights movement now is not the animal rights movement that I went into prison surrounded by. And so yeah, exactly like Jera, I kind of came out feeling very lost and very, I guess, almost kind of confused by where I fit into things, because my kind of activism didn't really exist anymore. And again, going back to like Laura, when she was saying, how do we get it back? Like for me, I kind of went into prison and there was this one type of activism, like mostly focused against vivisection and very confrontational and very like in your face and very personal. And then I got out and it's a much more kind of widespread and kind of mostly like meat-based movement. And it's a lot less confrontation, I suppose, than it used to be. And so kind of my skill set and my kind of like mentality towards the movement and towards activism, it felt very kind of disjointed, and only now I'm starting to kind of, I suppose, kind of find my way slowly back into the movement. And I think, yeah, that would have helped. But then the people that we knew had all gone for one reason or another. So there was no one left to hold our hands, I suppose. But something else on the prisoner support thing that I kind of feel I should say is, I think, because when I was in prison, I got a lot of letters and a lot of support, and it was all really appreciated. But I think a lot of people probably felt that, you know, they shouldn't send me anything that was like, you know, like communiques or photos of like animal liberations. And actually that was kind of all I really wanted. Like I wanted to like see pictures of animals that have been liberated from anywhere. And I couldn't ask for it, because if I were to ask for it, then my probation in prison would have put that against me. And then it kind of makes my life in prison, and then also on license when I get out, a lot harder, and I get a lot more restrictions. So I couldn't ask for these things, and people were like wary of sending them to me. So just a kind of a side note, but if you're supporting a prisoner for probably pretty much any political cause, it's very likely that that person does support direct action and is interested in that kind of side of the movement. So I would say kind of assume that they're interested in kind of being kept up to date, because the hardest thing is being disconnected from the campaign that is your life and that you love so much. So just bear in mind, if you do prisoner support, I reckon it's worth sending a picture of a liberated chicken or a liberated beagle every now and then.
Okay, we will keep that in mind. Thank you. The next question is also the person wants to thank you for the insights into the campaign, and thinks that the 6 points to organize effective targeted campaigns are very valuable. And the question is, what could be measures to be taken against government bailouts for such companies, and the continued criminalization of every step taken by the activists by the government?
So with the government bailouts, like that has literally never happened before, and it hasn't happened since. So because we didn't really go into it in any depth earlier, I'll just quickly kind of explain what happened. So basically the NatWest Bank had this big loan with Huntingdon. It was 22 million. And when we basically convinced NatWest not to, they got taken over by another company, and we convinced the other company not to renew their loan, basically. And so they kind of just wrote that off, and they cancelled Huntingdon's bank account. And obviously a commercial company isn't legally allowed to operate without a bank account. And so at that point, the Bank of England set up a bank account essentially for Huntingdon. And they are the only commercial company in the history of Britain to have a bank account with the Bank of England. And the same thing happened when Marsh, their insurance pulled out. Legally, a company has to have certain types of insurance. And so without an insurance broker, the British government, the Department of Trade and Industry with the British government, set up insurance account for Marsh. And again, they're the only company in British history who have, or who had an insurance run through the government. So, I mean, it's not really something most people are going to have to like find a way around. And very much at the time, our attitude was, especially with the bank account, like we had never targeted any company just for giving a bank account to Huntingdon, and we certainly weren't going to start with the British government. I think going back to what in hindsight that we could probably have changed, I do think something that we could have done with hindsight was probably focused on taking more legal actions and class actions and things like that. And I think it was probably corporate favoritism for the government. It was it's probably unlawful that they gave them a bank account, I reckon. And I think that's something that we could have explored, and you probably could try and take legal action against the government for giving a bank account to one company and no others to bail them out. And the continued criminalization of every step taken by the activists, by the government. Again, I think some of the laws they brought out were probably unlawful. I think the main one that they wanted to take us out with, which was the Serious Organized Crime Act, it basically criminalizes any, pretty much any action that causes a company connected to vivisection financial loss. There has to be like a civil offense or a criminal offense. But what that basically means is if I trespass on a chicken farm that breeds for meat, then I might get a fine, but probably I'll just get told to get off the land. If I trespass on a chicken farm that breeds chickens for animal testing, then I could be facing 5 years in prison. And I to this day, I'm certain that that law is unlawful. So I think you could probably go down that route and actually take legal challenges against some of these things. And we probably, if we'd had the time, we probably definitely should have.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, I wondered how you found life after getting out of prison. Were you able to travel, find work, and be involved in animal rights? I think you mentioned part of it already, but maybe you can.
So when you're initially released from prison, you are given a whole few pages of conditions, and it makes life very difficult. You can't actually get a job without permission from probation, and really any ideas you put forward for work, they turn them down. I wasn't allowed to use the internet, I wasn't allowed to use a phone, I wasn't allowed to use a computer, and at the same time they're like, go to the job centre and get a job. And so I go to the job centre and I say to the job centre, I've got these conditions, and they say, well, you're not available to work if you can't even use a computer. So you just end up in this endless loop of, you're just sort of in limbo while you're on under the restrictions. You know, I wasn't allowed to set up businesses, you know, I wasn't allowed to do graphic design. So they do make life very difficult for you. In terms of being able to travel, like while you're under the restrictions, you have to reside at home every night, so you can't really travel. You're not allowed to leave the country either. Definitely not allowed to be involved in animal rights. We all actually had antisocial behaviour orders on top of prison, which just banned us from protesting. Some people have got those for life, other people got them for around 5 years, so mine's expired now. But obviously, because we have convictions, like we can't travel to like America or Canada, so we are still restricted. But yeah, so like initially when you are released from prison, life is actually quite tough because you're very isolated. You've lost your whole support network. Like when Tom was released from prison, even though we're like in a relationship, we were not allowed to see each other. You know, you've gone from supporting him in prison because I was released first, and then he's released, and suddenly like we're not allowed to speak to each other, not allowed to see each other. We only got that overturned by like involving lawyers who were threatening to take them to court. So yeah, they throw everything at you. I think they just try and like grind you down, and they try and isolate you from other activists and your friends. Yeah, it's just trying to grind you down and put you off trying to return to the movement.
Yeah, I agree with that. I sort of feel like everything that they did to us was kind of designed to traumatize us. And like it's this kind of really weird mind-warping experience, because you go to your probation after prison and they kind of, like for me, they made me do this healthy identity intervention program, which was like designed for terrorism offenders. And it was kind of it's called healthy identity intervention. So it sort of seems like, you know, they're saying to you, your identity is unhealthy, you're sick in your mind, because all you want to do is to stop animal abuse. And you know that you can't really argue with them. You can't kind of go, oh, like, no, I'm actually right. Like, it's you guys who is wrong, because then they'll just write that into your notes. Oh, she's, you know, still an extremist. She's still determined to cause crime again. She's a risk. We might have to like send her back to prison. So like, I think it was this really kind of weirdly mind-warping experience. And again, like Nikki said, we weren't allowed to be involved in animal rights. For me, like my license conditions said I wasn't allowed to be involved in animal rights or animal welfare. And so I tried to get a job with like human rights and environmental organizations. And again, they refused to allow me to do that. They refused to even allow me to work for an organization that's run by lawyers that provides legal advice to people on death row in America. Apparently that was too political, and I was advised instead to try and find a job in a supermarket. I think that like everything that they did to us was kind of just designed to exert their power. But I tried to use that power to keep going. I could recognize that that's why they were doing what they were doing to us, was just designed to try and scare us and to bully us. And so I kind of just tried to use it to like inspire me of like, no, don't give in.
Yeah, I think it's worth considering, like, something I think people might not know. I mean, obviously we've all been through the kind of legal system, but if you do kind of face prison, I think there's kind of 3 stages to the kind of punishment. And the first is sometimes you're just remanded into prison, which did happen to some of us, but normally you'll kind of have a period of bail. So between when you're arrested and charged and when you go to prison, there's a period then you have the prison sentence, and then you're on license for the end of your prison sentence. Obviously this is in Britain. And so on that bail period at the beginning, for me and Nikki, it ended up being 3.5 years. We were basically just waiting to go to prison, because after, you know, we saw what happened with Jera, who, like, not to take away from the activism she actually did, but the things she was accused of, like, it was basically going on lawful protests and being part of a campaign that the police didn't like. And so when we saw that Jera was convicted and sent to prison, we kind of knew we were going to go to prison. So we spent all this time basically living like this half life where we can't start any new projects and we can't like start anything new in our life, because we know in like a year or 2 years or however long, we're just going to go to prison, and we don't know how long for. So that's a kind of weird period of your life. I actually found prison itself easier than being on license after prison. So I spent 2 years in prison, and then I spent 2.5 years on license. And there were things in prison that were really frustrating, because as the other two have said, the police pretty much found every way to psychologically kind of abuse us, really. And so in British prisons, there's certain things that generally happen to every prisoner as long as you kind of behave yourself. And they're often like in our kind of like crazy press, they're kind of made out to be like perks and bonuses, but they're actually just things that happen if you're a well-behaved prisoner. And some of these are like, you'll get like towards the end of your sentence, you'll get like day release, so you can go out for a day and see your family, or to get a job outside of the prison. And then you can kind of go to open prison, where those kind of things come more. And the point of it is to integrate you back into society and make it easier to kind of go from this living in a box to like living in the real world, which is a big psychological shock for a lot of people. But so when I was in prison, you know, like pretty much everyone was getting that, like people who like had done violent offenses and drug offenses, and even people on kind of like more minor terror offenses were getting these perks. And then obviously the prison warders were threatened by the police and told not to give us any of that. So we kind of had to deal with that. But aside from that, I found prison was boring, but you know, it's a very set environment, and you know what to expect, and you know what's going to happen, and the rules are the rules, and that's how it is, and you get on with it. When you come out into license, you then have this probation officer who basically dictates every single part of your life. And for me, this was for 2.5 years. I had someone who could just tell me whatever he wanted me to do, and if I said no, then I just get taken straight back to prison. And as much as I found prison easier, I didn't particularly want to go back, because I was trying to, like, after years and years and years of my life had been taken away, I was trying to push forward into restarting and rebuilding my life. And so it was things like Nikki said, like I couldn't use the internet, and they banned me from seeing her for a few weeks until we managed to get a lawyer to overturn it. I couldn't speak to my brother for 7 months after I got out of prison. I was put in a bail hostel for 7 months, I think it was. Yeah, and so basically this is where they put sex offenders for the most part. So I was surrounded by sex offenders for 7 months living in this horrible house thing. And every single person in there would come and go within like a month, 2 months, 3 months maximum. And I only got out because the bail hostel kind of tricked my probation, and they kicked me out. And so my probation officer would have had me in there probably for 2 years. And so that I found coming out of prison a lot harder, and the period after prison a lot harder than prison itself. And I'm entirely because my probation and the police kind of conspired to psychologically break me down. But I think it's definitely something to bear in mind, is that to save some resilience for that period, like when you got to get out of prison, it's not necessarily immediately over.
Okay, thank you. It sounds very frustrating, this period. We have more questions. The next question is, what line of defense did you feel was the most effective? Did you get the support that you felt was necessary from the legal team?
Jera.
I don't actually agree that my legal defense was the best. I sort of feel for them it's their job. Like, you know, they care about it as a salary. Maybe some of them are into it for good reasons as well. But at the end of the day, it's still a job to them. Whereas this is our lives, and this is the animals' lives. I kind of feel that I didn't necessarily get as good a defense as I should have. I wish that my defense team had gone in a different way than they had, because some people pled guilty in the lead up to our trial, because I don't believe that they would get a fair trial. Basically, my legal team told me that I had to accept that there had been a conspiracy to blackmail, and that the defense was basically to try and distance myself from that. But it's really hard to distance yourself from it when it's like, you know, your friends who you hung out with every single day, almost 24/7, and you're always around them, to then try and distance yourself from that and say, oh, well, they were involved in the conspiracy, but I wasn't. For a conspiracy to blackmail, you have to believe that your demand was unwarranted. And not for a second do I believe that any single one of us thought that our demand to companies to not deal with this laboratory that was exposed for horrendous, horrifying, soul-destroying animal abuse was at all unwarranted for a second. I think every single one of us thought that was a warranted demand to make. And so for me personally, I don't believe that any of us were guilty. And I'm destroyed sort of by our justice system that we were found guilty and we were sentenced to prison for something that, for me personally, I don't understand how any of us were guilty of.
I feel that for me and Nicola, Nikki, I think our legal team was better than Jera's. I feel like we were a lot happier with how we were defended. I think there were definitely things that really frustrated us with it. And we found ourselves in a very difficult situation, like as Jera said, because it was conspiracy to blackmail. And for that to apply, they just need to prove that there was a blackmail conspiracy. And if that conspiracy exists, then they just need to somehow connect you to it. And so when people pleaded guilty early on, they were admitting there was a blackmail conspiracy, and then we all just had to be kind of somehow slotted into their life, and then suddenly we're guilty too because we didn't stop them, really. And so we were in a very difficult situation where it becomes like trying to prove that all those things weren't right, when actually, like, obviously we were friends with our friends, and they pleaded guilty not because they'd done a blackmail conspiracy, but because they knew they wouldn't have a fair trial. And it all gets very complex, and you end up playing this horrible kind of game, really, where it's like trying to disprove each bit of like evidence, which actually you shouldn't need to disprove because it's a nonsense. Like, why should I have to say that this barbecue with my friends was a bad thing? Like, why do I have to explain why I went and collected firewood while it was still daylight? That was a question that was put to me. Like, obviously I collected fire, but who cares? Why is that a blackmail conspiracy? And all these kind of crazy things that you end up having to kind of play this, do this crazy dance and play this weird game where it kind of shouldn't be like that. And it is quite hard. And me and Nikki in the end didn't actually go to trial. We were ironically blackmailed into pleading guilty. And so we kind of didn't really get to do the defense that we probably would have done, but we were, and I think Jared the same, we were consistently, like, strongly, like, pressured away from having a big kind of show trial and showing all the abuse and all those kind of things. And I think the judge was, basically saying we couldn't show like the video of inside Huntingdon because it wasn't relevant. But, everything we were accused of doing, whether we did it or not, like, all of it was motivated by that video. So it's hard, like, even if you have a really good defense plan, like, the judge can be like, actually, you can't show that evidence. And then you're just there like, oh yeah, I was shouting outside this guy's house, but it's fine, honest. And to like a kind of British jury, it doesn't look fine, even if it is. So it's hard. I mean, I think a legal defense is a very personal thing, and I think it would have been nice if we could have all kind of arranged how best to like kind of present it and stuff, but really it's like, yeah, like everyone just kind of has to do what they think's best and take the advice available to them. And I mean, I would have liked to have had a big show trial, but unfortunately we didn't get to that point.
Yeah, I felt actually very supported by my legal team. Had two really good barristers, and I felt very supportive. I just think the frustrations sort of lied in, like, even they weren't allowed to, I guess, do it how we wanted. I remember my solicitor said, dark forces are at work here. He said that because the way our case was being conducted was not in a usual way. I just feel like we never had any hope of being acquitted. Just everything was being thrown against us. I just feel like we had no chance, and I just don't think any legal team could have changed the result.
I think actually, like our solicitor, I think like as much as we were kind of ground down and suffered burnout, I think he also was ground down and suffered burnt out from trying to pursue a case that he just could like increasingly realize like he had no chance of winning.
Yeah, I think as well, the Prime Minister of the UK was apparently expressed an interest in our trial. So I think, yeah, we didn't really stand much of a chance.
Okay, thank you. There are a lot of more questions. The next one would be, the animal rights movement and also society in general has changed a lot compared to 20 years ago. Do you think a pressure campaign like SHAC could still work today, or would we have to go about it very differently with all the digital surveillance happening these days?
I feel like we all talk about this quite a lot, like us three between ourselves, but again, it's I would kind of feel a bit wrong kind of saying like this is how campaigning should be done, and also just kind of not acknowledging that things do change, and often they change for the better. So I think the first thing would be to kind of decide whether a pressure campaign is the best way to deal with a specific campaign or target, and in many cases it quite possibly is the best way. In terms of whether it could be done, like, yes, definitely. I think things have changed. I think really since 9/11, like back in 2001, like everything changed in the world of kind of protest and the way protests were dealt with by the authorities. And I mean, protest almost kind of like has increasingly become kind of a dirty word. And if you kind of look at, say, like for Extinction Rebellion, for example, like who for me are quite a kind of fluffy campaigner, they do great stuff and a lot of arrests, but their actual activism is pretty fluffy. And they and you know, they're kind of getting like put on terror watch lists and kind of like getting all this like really negative media attention and backlash and stuff. So I kind of think maybe you would have to be a bit wary, but I can't see why it couldn't be done today. And I think, yeah, in some cases, it's probably what's needed. I think there's always a space for it. And I think in the animal rights movement, we have to kind of acknowledge that there's always been different elements to it. And all those elements generally help each other, although often various elements don't acknowledge or appreciate other elements at the time. And so there's a lot of things happening in the movement now, and I kind of think we should celebrate that. And I think if people want to start pressure campaigns or join pressure campaigns or anything else, then I think, yeah, like, great, there's definitely a place for it, and it can definitely win, and it can definitely work kind of symbiotically with what is happening at the moment. And I think, yeah, we all just kind of need to decide what our preferred way of doing things is and kind of work together.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I think also there needs to be different things in parallel probably. So yeah. Okay, we still have time for, I think, at least one more question. The next question would be, are the laws that sent you to jail still valid? Would it make sense for the animal rights movement to get together to legally fight them? If they are still...
me and Jera were convicted of blackmail, which is like an ancient kind of law in Britain. So yes, I mean, that's very much still there. I think I think there were things about the campaign and the length of our campaign that kind of made it easier, but I mean, it was also used against other campaigns at the time. And if there's a lawful campaign that has kind of a parallel unlawful campaign happening, I think it could very easily be used in exactly the same way again. Nikki was convicted of a slightly different law. So, and that does still exist, but maybe she wants to.
Yeah, so in the end, like, I sort of reached a deal with the prosecution. And so I didn't plead guilty to blackmail, I pled guilty to interfering with a contractual relationship of an animal research organisation. This law is still valid. I personally think this law is not legal, and actually I would actually really like to try and challenge it in some way. I'm not really sure how to go about that. But I do think it actually would be good for the movement to come together in some way to look at this law, to overturn it. Even, you know, for people outside the UK, like, you know, this law was copied from the US, and so other countries could copy this law. So I think like we all have an interest in seeing whether it could be challenged in some way.
Okay. So this could be a next target. Okay, I think we still have some time, so I will just read out the next question. So I think this is also for Tom again. You stated never give up. This is a personal question. The campaign influenced your whole life. How did you handle confrontation of family and friends who were not involved? So actually, this is also probably
well, my wife was involved, and my brother also went to prison for SHAC activism, or ALF, anti-Huntingdon activism. So some of my family, it was very easy. All of my friends were like militant vegan activists, so that was fairly easy. But my parents were not so keen, but it just, I mean, it's who I am, and it's, yeah, like, it's just so important. And when, like I say, obviously that experience I discussed earlier when I met the beagles inside the breeder, but you know, just seeing the footage of like dogs being punched in the face, and even the things that are like, because that was like an unlawful thing that happened in the laboratory, but even the like things that are just business as usual and day-to-day happenings inside that laboratory of animals being cut up and poisoned and burnt and all sorts of things. I don't really care what other people think, to be honest, like whether they're related to me or whatever. Like, that stuff has to stop, and it always just kind of felt like I was someone willing to stand up and try and stop it. So if people wanted to help, great, and if they wanted to criticize, then they could do that. But yeah, I just wanted to stop abuse, and not much else mattered.
Yeah, like Tom said, my partner at the time was also prosecuted for this too. So and all of my friends were also involved in it, so that was relatively easy. My family were totally in support of our cause and our aims. And I think that like when my mother attended the trial, she saw like how bizarre this trial was, and she said she'd always had faith in the British justice system, which is something that I perhaps never had. But she had like trusted like this British justice system was sort of going to find us innocent. And she said like when we all got found guilty, it was kind of heart-wrenching for her. She like realized this institution that she had trusted to do the right thing can't be trusted. And I think that maybe that's like, you know, we need to stop trusting these institutions with our justice, with achieving justice, because they won't achieve it. To achieve justice is down to all of us. And I think that, of course, my mother didn't want to see me sent off to prison, but like Tom said, I think it's who I am, and I think that she'd rather I stay true to myself than be someone who I'm not.
Yeah, actually, I think like the whole kind of court case and prison side was the worst part in terms of dealing with my family. There was like a few things, and as we mentioned earlier, the police kind of really used the media to kind of smear us, but also in court, like they literally, because of the conspiracy to blackmail, like any action that was taken against Huntingdon since I think 2001 was like our fault. And so there was like actions that were kind of like distasteful, and there was actions that were frankly immoral, and all kinds of things that some of them we thought were great and some of them we thought were just shouldn't have happened, and in some cases were even just wrong, and all of it was obviously dumped on us. And I know in court I kind of had to pretend to my mum and dad that I'd left some of the stuff I needed for prison at home, just so that they would be out of the court when certain things that had nothing to do with me were read out, and as if I had some kind of involvement in them. And I know, like, my granddad, the first he knew about it all was he read about it in the Daily Mail, I think, like my kind of face on the front page of the Daily Mail being sent off to prison for being a terrorist. And like, my dad had a heart attack when I went to prison. He was fine, but he had a heart attack when I went to prison. And so I mean, that was definitely the worst part of it, and all over things that like actually like I'd had no involvement in and weren't anything to do with me. But yeah, I get sent to prison and my family gets torn apart for a conspiracy against me, which was that was definitely the worst thing in terms of my family. They was very supportive, but like of me, not of what I'd done, but what accused of doing. Yeah, it's hard. Families are hard, aren't they?
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and this would be, sorry for that. Did you ever think that you went too far on grounds of attacking the persons that you targeted?
I don't know if this is directed at us individually or at the campaign or at the kind of wider anti-HLS movement, but for me, I can't think of any personal situations where I did anything that I thought was too far. I think I certainly attended protests that I left because I didn't like how they were going. They weren't actually SHAC protests, but kind of wider anti-vivisection protests. I remember there's one at a hospital because they had an animal testing laboratory there, and then people were shouting abuse at the people going in, and I was like, this isn't me, and this isn't what I agree with. So I left that one. So so I mean, I've seen things go further than I would agree with, and as I said, there were definitely actions that took place against HLS that I didn't approve of and I didn't like, and there were definitely things that either went too far or were just kind of more broadly kind of problematic actions, you know, actions based maybe in like sexism or whatever. And yeah, so there's definitely things that I didn't like that happened against HLS, but I mean, it was a huge campaign. I think, you know, in the UK, we could sometimes get like a few thousand people on a protest, and across the world, we were active in like, I think there was like 26 countries and every inhabited continent on the planet. So obviously it was just a mass movement, and we kind of embraced like direct action and everything everyone was doing. So yeah, there were certainly things that some people did that went too far, and there was certainly probably people who were targeted that shouldn't have been targeted. In fact, there definitely were people who were targeted who shouldn't have been targeted. But in terms of each of us, I mean, I don't think I ever did anything that went too far, and I kind of feel I would have said something or walked away if I ever felt that. But the people I knew in my group weren't like that.
I think it's also worth bearing in mind that this was a huge campaign, and the vast majority of actions weren't illegal. They weren't targeting people personally. It's just like a very small minority of actions, and I guess they were what attracted the media, you know, to try and drive public opinion. So like, you know, that they were a small minority, and I think it's worth putting the focus on the actions of the majority. And you know, and we did achieve a lot, and that was all done like lawfully. And you know, most of the people in our trial had no links whatsoever to personal attacks or direct action. You know, I was convicted basically for putting information out into the public domain, and you know, it's not my responsibility how people act on that.
And I think you're putting publicly available information in the public domain. It's not like you're putting personal people's details. I agree with what Tom and Nikki have both said. I don't believe that I personally went too far in attacking any person. I don't really think that I did attack anyone. But that said, I think that like it is important that we recognize that companies, they're run by individuals. It's individuals who are responsible for company policy. It's not a faceless corporation. It's a person behind that. And I think like You know, no, I'm not saying let's go and target these people, destroy their lives, but I think that they should be held accountable until they stop torturing animals. I feel like it's very, you know, it's not too much to ask.
I think as well, it's when it comes to critique, because obviously like none of us did anything that was particularly too far against an individual, but when it comes to critiquing other people's actions, I think it's always worth remembering that our movement is very unusual in that we're a movement consisting solely of allies. So say for example, if I was to go on like an anti-racist protest, there presumably would be people there that if I did something that wasn't beneficial to the community I was trying to protect, people could say, can you not do that? Whereas with the animal liberation movement, we're only allies. There's like the animals can't tell us you've gone too far, like, or that action isn't appropriate, or that's not helping in the long term. It's up to each of us to decide what the best course of action is. And really for me, the only way I can do that is to think, what would I want if I was an animal in a laboratory, or if I was an animal in an abattoir, or if I was an animal in a zoo? And I struggle to think of an action that would be going too far if I was in that situation. Not that I'm condoning everyone do go out and do whatever you want, but I think it's hard for me to kind of put that kind of threshold on things, because what would I want done for me? Pretty much anything.